Built like an absolute tank. It is so solid. Read speeds of up to 7,000 megabytes a second. You're almost getting double the frame rate that you can get on an Xbox Series X. How is that not impressive? Hello, and welcome to a super special build guide all about building a next generation gaming PC that you can actually use as a console replacement. It's going to have more performance and yet a very similar size and overall package. There is so much tasty gear on this table, it is incredible. So as always, we're going to show you what everything is, how it goes together, how easy the build process is, and of course show you gameplay benchmarks so you know exactly how this thing performs and just what it can do. Now this video is proudly sponsored by Samsung, who sponsored this video and sent out this, the brand new 980 Pro NVMe SSD. And this thing is the real deal. Read speeds of up to 7,000 megabytes a second. Not megabits, 7,000. This thing is ridiculously quick. I've been using Samsung in my personal PCs for years. The thing is though, having a super fast SSD like this is not only going to be incredible for performance today, with super fast boot times and application load times, and game load times as well, but in the future, we're likely to see it actually have even more of a benefit when it comes to gaming with things like Microsoft's Direct Storage API that's going to allow your computer to just have lower overheads and actually read from the SSD more efficiently. But I'm getting ahead of myself, so let's walk you through some of the other components in this build. Our main gaming component is this, the RTX 3070. This is the Founders Edition, and it is the first year that this is actually my favorite variant of the card. Yes, you can get bigger ones like the Gaming X for instance, but they're overkill and a lot more expensive. This is brilliant actually because it's so small and it works very efficiently. You just need to make sure you have a case that can accommodate its sort of next generation airflow design. As if you're blowing into like a steel plate or something, then obviously it's just not going to work at all. What else do we have? We have our Ryzen processor. This is a Ryzen 7 3700X, and immediately you guys are thinking, oh my word, why is he not using the latest generation? This guy's a fraud. I clicked on the wrong video. I regret it. But when it comes to price and performance, those two things aren't interchangeable. I reckon you'll be able to get these in a sale for a much lower price than the newer ones for the next few months or so. And so if you're playing at 1440p or 4K, it may well be worth actually saving your money, getting a CPU like this, and then spending more money on your graphics card, because that's going to be realistic. Whereas obviously if you can get the newer chips for a similar price to this, then that makes a whole lot more sense. Either way, both are great, but if you are playing at 1080p, then this is when you're going to start to notice a big difference really between this and the newer chips. Our motherboard is a B550 motherboard, so it supports PCIe Generation 4 speeds, which is imperative of course for our 980 Pro SSD, but you will need to do a BIOS update on this if you're wanting to use Ryzen 5000 series. Thankfully you can do this on this particular board with just a USB stick, no CPU required. But of course this is a ITX motherboard. I love the Gigabyte boards actually because they look pretty cool, they stand out. It does have a whole host of other features of course as well, things like support for RGB lighting if that's your thing, overclocking your CPU, a very good I/O. The really exciting bit for a lot of you is going to be the case. This is the NR200. This is from Cooler Master and it is built like an absolute tank. It is so solid, and you've got two different designs as well, so you can sort of use a vertical GPU mount and show it off a bit, or you can have it in the normal way and then mount a radiator on the side. There's quite a few different ways of doing it. We will of course need an SFX power supply. Here we have the V650 from Cooler Master. They're ridiculously tiny. Power supplies are normally pretty boring, but when you pick this up and actually have a look at it for the first time, I think you'd be a bit like, whoa! That's small! And it's also got a fanless mode as well, up to 15% I believe. So if you're just using your computer in the desktop or something, then it's going to be practically silent. The thing that I'm not quite so sure about though is the CPU cooler, and I think this should work. It should be fine. This is a 240mm radiator, and I almost wanted to really push this thing to the limit and see just what it can do, because it does support custom loops, so I'd like to think this shouldn't be too much of a problem, but obviously something big in a small case is always a little bit of a challenge. And I believe we have forgotten the RAM. This is brand new from XPG. They sent this out. This is the D50. And XPG are a little bit hit and miss, I think, with their designs, but I really like this one because not only do you have the RGB on the top, which a lot of people are going to like, but the RAM itself is very well built and it's almost quite metallic. It's very solid, which means it's time to actually build this thing. So let's put our parts to one side and grab our motherboard out of the box. I am so excited about builds. I love builds. Builds are the best. You'll see now exactly what I was talking about when I said that this was a very feature-rich board. There's a lot going on here. There's that slot on the back if you want to put another drive in there, but again, that's PCI Gen 3, not 4. It's worth noting as well that actually our NVMe drive has some thermal management going on. It's got, I think it's a nickel coating on the controller, so that it actually thermally manages itself rather than requiring a really big heatsink. But obviously if you do have one, it's going to make sense to use it. Here's that little button that I was talking about earlier, QFlash Plus. This is what you're going to use to flash the BIOS if you've got a USB drive. But otherwise, put it down on top of your motherboard box. Let's start with our CPU. Open up the socket on the motherboard with the lever arm, take out your CPU, and then line up the gold arrow with the arrow on the motherboard, and then just place this down nice and gently till it sits in place. Lever down. Then we can grab our super fast 980 Pro SSD, use a smaller screwdriver to undo the 2 screws on top of the heatsink, take that piece off, and then remove the SSD screw itself. Then you can grab your drive and gently slot this in place. There's only one right way of doing it. Lower this back down, then grab your little heatsink and remove the cover on the back. This is going to allow you to get nice contact on the thermal pad, and then put it all back together and screw it down. Which then leaves our RAM, random access memory. Memory is RAM. ITX does of course only support 2 sticks of RAM, so that's why we're using 16 gig of 3600 megahertz RAM here. Only one right way of putting it in, so just line up the slots and then push it down until it clicks, which then leaves us motherboard complete. You can see it's a very dense bit of kit. The whole theming actually works really well here. Actually, I didn't plan that out. The RAM seems to perfectly color match the rest of the Aorus board, so I've done well there. So you can see in the default mode, you have this little radiator mount here that you can use for the 240, and I think that's what we're going to do. Or you can vertically GPU mount and then have a radiator down the bottom, but that might struggle with some different tubes. It depends how long your tubes are. Very big accessories box that should include some fans and that PCIe riser cable if you do want to vertically GPU mount. I think the main limitation is just that you can't put any radiator at the top. It might look like there's room, but there's not a bracket for it. They're just expecting fans only. I think you wouldn't really have the clearance at the top. Let's start by actually laying our case down flat though, grabbing our motherboard and just gently putting this in place. So let's screw this down into place. It's not necessarily going to be the prettiest build in the world if you use a radiator like we're doing here, because you're not going to be able to put it down the bottom unless it's a custom loop. Because of the way the tubing works, if you imagine you have your graphics card here, it's going to be quite difficult to get that to sort of flex down. You might be able to do it, but it's going to depend more on the graphics card that you have. But clearance is definitely going to be an issue. That's why it's down there for custom loops that can sort of do tubing to go in a different direction, I guess. So if you're after a bit more of a prettier build, then you're going to have to use a smaller air cooler on this, and then you can use it in the more traditional manner, use that tempered glass side panel, and then have something that's a bit more visually appealing. I think the next thing is going to be to put that power supply in, because I want to get all of the cables in first before we add anything else, because it's just going to get a little bit tricky, I think. Here's that tiny little thing I was talking about earlier. Diddy, look, smaller than my hand. Top piece comes off nice and easily, and then you can slide your power supply down and in, I think. So I've loosened up these screws, and then this should, in theory, just sit back in place. Your power supply does have this little cable extension that does need to be plugged in as well. I'm so glad that they actually made this modular, as it means we don't have to put all of these cables in there, just the ones that we actually need. So here we have our CPU, so that can plug in at the top first. You're meant to cable manage with these straps down here, but obviously that's not really going to look particularly nice. That's the only thing about doing that. And then the cables you get in the box are a bit too small to do it any other way. Let's move on to the graphics card next. And yes, I know this is a bit of a weird order, not doing the CPU cooler, but I definitely think that needs to be the last thing you do if you're using a radiator of any kind here. But our RTX 3070 should just drop in nice and neatly. There are those cables there, so this is going to take a little bit of planning. I wish I could show you this, but I don't have the facilities. There we have our GPU in the system. Our fans should be pretty simple to install actually, because they have like this push system that they just push into place. Okay, that is pretty easy. Clicks into place, not going anywhere. Which means we should just be able to drop this down into place as it was. Click, click. You will need this little splitter though, otherwise you won't be able to plug anything in. Which brings us on to the bit that I've not been looking forward to, which is the CPU cooler. It's a big cooler for a small space. My brain is so active right now, really trying to not make any mistakes. You know, if it happens, but it's definitely got a bit more difficult than a usual build at this stage. So let's fit the CPU cooler onto its mount, and then we'll drop the radiator in. So we have these loose fan cables that we need to plug in. There is some RGB as well. Oh, it's old RGB. This motherboard has addressable RGB, so we can't use it. No RGB. And the moment of truth. Hooray! That does at least fit in. Let's just hope it works. All things considered then, this is what the finished product looks like. Obviously you can neaten it up, but the point is it doesn't really matter. I did start and then realized that I didn't need to because you can put a couple of cables around the back. But again, unless you're using that tempered glass side panel, you don't need to worry so much about cable management from an aesthetic point of view. Just don't block any fans in terms of actually gumming them up with the cable, and of course make sure there is decent airflow. And there you go, our finished ITX PC. Oh, that one was risky, wasn't it? That one was risky. Pretty nervous about this one then. Well, we have noise, insert, boot media. Yes! The thing that I really love about this case though is its upgradability, as all the hardware inside is still quite accessible. Obviously it is a bit more tricky than a full-size case, but that's besides the point. But then you compare it to something like the H1 from NZXT, and while that does have a little bit more in the compromise department, like you can only get that single 120mm cooler for the CPU, you can't do any water cooling really in that very easily, but I'd say that was actually a much easier case to build in, and that's still quite easy to upgrade as well. But yeah, on the whole, pretty impressed really. The main thing is that this thing looks sleek, it's got good airflow, relatively easy to build in. I'd say this was a easy, hard build. So looking forward to actually testing out its performance. Here we are then, our battle station is now complete. It's looking mighty fine. All I've done so far is actually enable XMP to get that memory running at 3600 MHz and tune the fans. This file right here is called a Blackmagic B-RAW file, and this is what I use to actually film these videos. But because this file was so big, copying it across to this PC took around about 30 seconds, but this is only 16 gig. If we wanted to go for like a 200 gig file, you can imagine all of this time starts to add up. But if I duplicate this, just to show you the speed of the SSD that's in here, rather than taking 30 seconds, you can see that copies in, what's that, 1.8 gigabytes a second, and that took, what, 10 seconds? It is ridiculously impressive stuff, and I really can't wait to see not only what this can do in a whole host of different applications, but future applications as well. As I say, gaming in particular, that direct storage API. Here's Forza Horizon 4, and we can open up this Festival Sprint, say OK, pick a car, and this is the loading screen here, and you'll see that took what? Pretty much no time at all. How is that not impressive? So as usual, we have the frame rate located in the top left-hand corner of your screen, and we're currently getting, what's that, around about 115 frames a second, 110 frames a second. This is ultra settings 4K. So I've been talking a lot about the whole next generation consoles and how they can do 4K 60 and do a really good job of keeping it super smooth. But if you have a 4K high refresh rate monitor like we're using here, then what, you're almost getting double the frame rate that you can get on an Xbox Series X. I always love to show you games that I'm currently playing right now, and actually one of those is Gears Tactics, and truth be told, I only started playing this for the Xbox review because it was one of the optimized titles, but I love this. It's a very visual game actually for a strategy. You don't often get this. I guess it's because they can reuse assets between proper Gears of War and then Gears Tactics, but it is very demanding to run though. We're currently getting, what is that, 60 frames a second, pretty much bang on. We are running unlimited frame rate, that isn't capped, it is just a demanding title. But for a game like this is obviously perfect. It's all you need and a whole lot more. Next up we have Control with ray tracing. This is running at ultra settings, but I have turned ray tracing down to medium, and this is going to get us around about 55 to 60 frames a second. This is one of the best looking games you can play at the moment, and of course with that ray tracing you get even better, more fancy reflections and things. But last and definitely not least, we have Fortnite, everybody's favourite. And this is running 4K DLSS, recording with Shadowplay, which is why we're getting a little bit of stutter, but we're getting, what's that, 98 frames a second, 99 frames a second at the moment. Really not too shabby whatsoever now, is it? This game is just so bright, it's like they've got the saturation slider and gone vroom. I will draw your attention to the clock speed once again at the top left of this screen though, because while the PC is very quiet, we are getting slightly reduced boost clock as we're hitting that 77 degrees, which I say is disappointing. It's not really going to translate into a big deal, and you can always just increase the temperature target anyway to sort of get around that. But it is definitely worth noting. And for those of you that want to run 1440p, to give you an idea, this is DLSS once again, but Fortnite Ultra Quad HD, and we're now getting upwards of 170 frames a second, sometimes 180. This thing has a lot going for it. There's just so much hardware you can stick inside without really compromising too much on usability, thermals, or acoustics. The thing for me that I just love is just how it's so compact, yet there's not really that much of a compromise. Yes, you're going to need a smaller power supply, but you can actually get upwards of 850. So in theory, you could actually put something like an RTX 3090 in here if you really wanted to. Not sure how well that would work out thermally, but you know, not too bad. It probably can be done. And of course, a massive thank you to Samsung for supplying the 980 Pro and sponsoring this video. It is much appreciated. If you want to learn a little bit more about just how fast this thing is and what it can do for you, then you can check out more details linked down in the description below. Thank you so much for watching. Like that video if you've enjoyed it, and I'll see you in the next one. Ah, the zone! The zone! The zone! I'm not going to make that. Samsung, you've cost me the game.